All right, so today I'm going to be testing out the airflow and noise performance between 4 very popular fans, or I guess I should say 3 popular fans and 1 new fan that you may or may not have heard of by now. It's the Fantex T30-120. They just came out with this. It's a 120 millimeter fan, but it's 30 millimeters thick, which is 5 millimeters thicker, of course, than the vast majority of fans out there. So just bear that in mind right off the bat if you are going to pick up one of these at some point, that you make sure you have enough clearance in your case because they are a bit thicker than your average fan. But the other fans we'll be testing today are the Noctua NF-F12, as well as the Corsair ML120 Pro, and the Silent Wings 3 from Be Quiet, which I already have mounted right here on our testing kit. This testing kit is kind of what sparked the idea for this whole video. It was sent over by Fantex along with their new T30 fans, and it's actually a way to objectively measure airflow and noise between fans. So I thought that was kind of interesting and thought it'd be a fun opportunity to share the results with you guys. So the way this sort of works, I guess I'll just explain this. Right now you can see that on one end of this tube, it's basically a long tunnel. On one end you have whatever fan you're testing, and you can test it in a variety of configurations. I'll be testing 4 different environments today. Right now there's actually, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a radiator mounted on it behind the fan right now in a push configuration to add some resistance to this particular test. With the kit came these panels that you can slap onto the front of any fan you're testing in order to create environments of varying restriction levels. So this one right here is sort of like a mesh front panel of a case that also has like sort of a built-in dust filter. It's a very fine mesh on one side and then more open on the other. Very popular, very commonly used in a lot of cases. And then the other panel that we'll be testing with is just a completely front solid panel that does have ventilation on either side. So I'll actually be testing each of these fans in 4 different scenarios today. The first of which being unrestricted, which means nothing on either side of the fan. Just the fan, completely bare, no radiator, nothing. And that's not really realistic because in most builds you're not going to have a case where, or a scenario where there's absolutely nothing on either side of the fan, but it's still kind of interesting to get that data to figure out where each of these, how these fans stack up against each other in a completely bare bones environment when they're just standing alone. The next scenario is with this panel, the mesh and dust filter. Obviously no radiator, but just this panel right up front. Then the one after that is with the closed panel. And then the 4th and final test environment I'll be testing these fans in is with the radiator and the mesh front panel installed. Between those 4 tests, we should be able to get a wide variety of data regardless of environment, so we can sort of gauge, how good a fan performs as a case fan versus a radiator fan versus up against a mesh dust filter and that sort of thing. So now I'm essentially going to be using 2 different testing methods today, one to measure noise and another to measure airflow. The first of which, measuring noise, is considered an airflow normalized test, whereby I basically tune each fan. I'll have it hooked up to this Noctua fan controller, and it's got a little dial on it. And I'll basically tune each fan until it hits my target FPM, or feet per minute, essentially how much air each fan is moving through this tunnel. And I'm going to be measuring FPM with this anemometer. I believe that's how it's pronounced, maybe not. But this anemometer is actually fixed to the other end of this tube. It's got a little propeller on it, and it spins as the air flows through it, and it gives me an output in feet per minute. I'm also going to be converting that to CFM later in case you guys want to see those numbers as well. And then basically once I have each fan tuned to that FPM, which I've set as 400 feet per minute is the target that I'm going for, then I bust out my sound meter, put it the same distance away from the fan for each test, and then I record the maximum decibel reading within a 30-second period in order to gauge just how loud the fan is operating at that FPM. One thing to note is that I did run one test with a target FPM of 350 as opposed to 400. And that was actually with this test, but the radiator and the mesh dust filter, mainly because one of these fans, or maybe even 2 of them, I think it was either the Noctua and the Silent Wings 3, or both of them, were unable to achieve an FPM of 400 in this particular environment because there's just so much restriction involved. So for that particular test, the target FPM was set to 350, but for all the other ones in the airflow normalized test, the FPM that we're going for is 400. Then the second method, which we're using to test airflow, is essentially a noise normalized test, where we kind of do the same thing that we just did, but in reverse. So I set up the fan and I bust out the sound meter, and I use the Noctua fan controller in order to tune the fan until we hit a target decibel rating, maximum target decibel rating, which I've designated as 50 dB. So once the fan's at 50 decibels consistently, then I measure the FPM that the fan is actually putting out. And that'll allow us to objectively compare the airflow performance between each fan at a given acoustic level. I should also mention that all the while I'll also be recording the RPM of each fan through the BIOS, the maximum RPM that any particular fan being tested hits within a 30-second period. So that's what we're doing today. I've actually already done all the testing. I spent a good many hours testing all these fans, and the results are really interesting, so I'm actually pretty excited to share them with you guys. Why don't we check them out now? Before we continue, this video is brought to you by Kioxia. Kioxia actually has a rich history in the tech industry as being the inventor of NAND flash memory. But they also have a full lineup of SSDs for pretty much any occasion, whether you're looking to drop an NVMe drive into an enterprise data center or a crypto mining rig. Gaming piece, I meant to say game, son of a. With competitive PCIe Gen 3x4 speeds, the BG4 and XG6 series are well suited for gaming systems, while the CD6 and CM6 feature leading-edge PCIe Gen 4 performance for Milan and Ice Lake servers. To learn more about everything Kioxia has to offer, click on the link in the description below. Alright, so first looking at our airflow normalized test where we're measuring noise. We're comparing noise right now between these fans. The first test I ran here was the unrestricted environment. Nothing on either side of the fan, just pure naked fanness. And the target FPM again was 400 FPM. And you can see here that the Fantex T30 actually took the lead, getting a dBA or a decibel rating of 37.8, which is significantly quieter than any other fan here. You can see that there's just a huge gap, almost 12, 13, 14 decibels difference between the T30 and the next quietest fan, which was the Silent Wings 3 at 50.7 decibels. So still very quiet, but obviously the Fantex, the T30 is in a completely different class at this point. And you can see it's operating at the lowest RPM out of the group, 754 RPM. Something to note really quick about the Silent Wings 3 is that it definitely had the wildest RPM swings out of the four fans here. Most of the other fans, actually all the other fans only range, they kind of bounced around 5, 10 RPM plus or minus thereabouts. Whereas the Silent Wings 3, I was seeing RPM swings upwards of like 50 RPM at times, but it still manages to stay consistently quiet despite that, which is kind of surprising, but just something to note there. It was bouncing around, RPM's bouncing around all over the place with the Silent Wings 3. And then the next quietest fan, or the next loudest fan at this point, I guess, would be the Noctua NF-F12 at 51 decibels, probably margin of error right here, just about as quiet as the Silent Wings 3 when unrestricted. And then the Corsair ML120 Pro, which had the highest RPM out of the group, as you can see, 862 RPM, was also the loudest in this particular environment at 52.4 decibels. I would take, out of all the tests that we're running today, this is probably the unrestricted test is the one I would take with the biggest grain of salt, just because it's not very common in a build where you're not going to have anything on either side of the fan. Maybe in like the most open air chassis build or something, if the fan's just kind of suspended and hanging there, and at that point, if it's that open of a chassis, then airflow is probably not as important, but just something to bear in mind and kind of interesting to see the data here. Next up, we have also with the airflow normalized test, the mesh and dust filter. So the mesh and dust filter panel, no radio or anything like that. And you can see here that the Fantex T30 once again takes the lead, albeit by a smaller margin this time, 50.7 dB, with the Silent Wings 3 coming in second place again, actually tying for second with the Corsair ML120 Pro, getting a decibel readout of 54.7. That is notably louder than the T30, and as you can see, the T30 definitely ramped up in volume once it was faced with a bit of restriction. Finishing last in this test was the Noctua NF-F12, getting a decibel readout of 56.5 and an RPM of 1069. Not too much louder than Silent Wings 3 and ML120 Pro, but definitely the loudest in this particular test. It's also worth noting that once again, the Fantex T30 is running at the lowest RPM out of the group, most likely due to the fact that it's got thicker blades, just a bigger chassis, bigger fan design in general. It's able to spin slightly slower while still delivering really good acoustic performance. The third test, of course, is the closed panel. So this is completely closed off, the most choked for airflow, I would say, out of the bunch. And you can see here the T30 once again topping the charts at 51 decibels. It remained significantly quieter once again than the other three fans. Silent Wings 3 showing pretty consistent performance as being the runner-up behind the T30 in terms of noise output. 56.9 decibel readout versus 58.8 on the ML120 Pro, and the Noctua NF F12 getting 58.9 Margin of error here, these are pretty much similar, I would say, between these two fans. But again, the Noctua NFF12 is looking like the loudest fan on this list so far, especially when you're introducing lots of restriction into the equation. And then finally, we have the radiator plus the mesh dust filter front panel. Remember, this is at a slightly lower target FPM of 350. Unsurprisingly, at this point, T30 comes in first place with the quietest readout of 52.4, Silent Wings 3 in second with 55.4, and then we have the NFF12 actually outpacing the ML120 Pro here just slightly at 55.6 with the ML120 in dead last. So clearly the ML120 Pro makes for the loudest radiator fan in the bunch, but of course noise is just one aspect of today's testing. We also have to look at airflow. So this is our noise normalized test where we're measuring airflow between fans. And as you can see here, I have the CFM conversion based on the volume of the tunnel. So I was able to do some simple math, which is, according to the Fantech's guidebook, is 0.132 just times the FPM, and that gives you your CFM readout there. So right out of the gate, the Fantech's T30 was the top airflow performer with 466 FPM or 61.5 CFM. And that's, I wouldn't say a landslide, because trailing right behind it is the ML120 Pro at 454 FPM, which is right hot on the heels of the T30. Again, this is probably the least valuable test, being completely unrestricted, but something worth noting. In third place, we have the Silent Wings 3 with an FPM of 428, and finishing dead last in this test was the Noctua NFF12 with an FPM of 402. And also notice the really low RPM of our NFF12 here compared to the other fans, mainly because, as we just saw, this is the noisiest fan out of the bunch, and so it's really not able to ramp up much higher than this without overshooting our target of 50 decibels, hence the lower airflow readout. Next up, we have our mesh and dust filter test, and you can see here the T30, once again, tops the charts with 399 FPM, or a CFM of 52.6, followed by the Corsair ML120 Pro, giving us a readout of 374. That's also pretty much within earshot of the T30. And then we have Silent Wings 3, once again in third place with 340 FPM, or a CFM of 44.88. And then finally, unsurprisingly, the NFF12 finishes last with the lowest airflow performance at our target decibel rating. When we switched over to a closed panel in order to mimic a choked off front panel of a case, we saw that the T30 still outperformed the rest, getting an FPM of 407. This time it really outpaces the others by a lot, which just goes to show it's got a lot of good static pressure. Because the closed panel is really right up against the fan blades. And I think the thicker form factor of the T30 really helps in this area, along with the fan blade design and stuff. But then you can see here, tied for second actually, was the Silent Wings 3 and the ML120 Pro. So where the ML120 Pro does really well in a mesh and dust filter environment, it kind of crumbles when it's up against a choked off panel of a case. I wouldn't say it's terrible performance, but it's notably worse performance than when it has a little bit more breathing room. And then the NFF12, actually kind of not too far off from the other two fans here that it's between. This is definitely margin of error, but still was showing the lowest FPM of 330 or a CFM of 43.5. And for the record, kind of opposite of what we just saw with the NFF12, notice how the RPM of the T30 is much higher than the other fans, and it's able to hit that because it's such a quiet fan. It's ramping up to a much higher RPM without overshooting the target noise level, which explains why it's able to deliver so much airflow even in a really restrictive environment. And our final test measuring airflow is our radiator and mesh dust filter test. And you can see here that the T30, once again, is at the top, 363 FPM or a CFM of 47.9. Although this time the RPM of this fan is not notably higher. It's actually lower than some of the other fans on this list. Compared to the previous test. I think that's just because with so much static pressure requirement on either side of the fan now, with the radiator on one end and the mesh dust filter on the other, that really puts a lot of restriction on the fan and more or less creates more turbulence, which is going to increase the noise output. So the fan couldn't really spin much faster than this without going over that 50 decibel rating. In second place, we have a tie between the Silent Wings 3 and the ML120 Pro. They each got 319 FPM, so pretty much on par with each other in terms of airflow performance here when paired with a radiator and mesh dust filter. And finally, finishing last, you might have guessed it, is the Noctua NFF12 with a CFM of 40 and an FPM of 304. And once again, we can see that really low RPM, indicating that compared to the other fans that we're testing today, the NF-F12 is definitely the loudest. All right, so summing up all the data that we just gathered, the Fantex T30 was the quietest fan in all scenarios by a landslide. I think it's the unit's thickness and blade design that really allows it to run at a lower RPM than the other fans at a lower noise level, which puts it in a class of its own, as I keep on saying, because it's true. It ran impressively quiet at pretty much any degree of restriction, which makes it the obvious first choice if acoustics are a top priority. Noise-wise, the runner-up was the Be Quiet Silent Wings 3. While its performance isn't in the same class as the Fantex T30, it does consistently beat out the other fans in this area while delivering the same amount of airflow. Despite having the biggest RPM swings of any fan, it offered excellent acoustics across all restriction levels, making it pretty much just as versatile as the Fantex T30. The Corsair ML120 Pro and Noctua NF-F12 tie for being the noisiest fans in all environments, with both being especially loud when mounted against a solid case panel. The NF-F12 rivals the noise levels of the Silent Wings 3 when unrestricted, making it a viable option as a quiet case fan if it's faced with zero restrictions, but as we've said, that's an uncommon scenario in most builds. The ML120 Pro tested to be the loudest radiator fan in the bunch, albeit this was by a small margin behind the NF-F12 and Silent Wings 3. When it comes to airflow, the Fantex T30 leads in this area as well. The Corsair ML120 Pro gets within striking distance of it when unrestricted or in a mesh and dust filter environment, but the T30 soars ahead in more heavily static pressurized scenarios, such as behind a closed-off case panel or strapped to a radiator. The results show us that the T30 is pretty much the best performer when it comes to both airflow and acoustics, again thanks to its beefy size and design. The airflow runner-up is more or less a tie between the ML120 Pro from Corsair and the Be Quiet Silent Wings 3. Where the ML120 lacks in acoustics, it compensates with being able to move lots of air when restricted. Particularly when mounted to a mesh panel with a dust filter, it trounces the Silent Wings 3. But the Silent Wings 3 keeps pace with it elsewhere, and it runs consistently quieter in all environments. The Noctua NF-F12 delivered the worst airflow performance among its peers. To be fair, it's never too far behind the ML120 Pro and Silent Wings 3, but it's also tied for being the loudest fan here, making it the last recommendation unless you really favor its aesthetics above all else. The final verdict? Between our 4 test subjects, the Fantex T30-120 was hands down the best performer in both airflow and acoustics, regardless of restriction level. So whether you need a fan for your case or a radiator, it's the clear choice if you just want the best of the best. But you'll need to be wary of its additional thickness posing any clearance issues. In my opinion, the runner-up here overall is the Be Quiet Silent Wings 3 for its versatile performance while staying nice and quiet despite its sweeping RPM. Contrasting the Silent Wings 3's flexibility, the Corsair ML120 Pro makes the most sense against a dust filter and mesh surface for airflow and the least sense with a closed panel for noise. It's a solid performer for radiators, if not a smidge louder than the Silent Wings 3 in that environment. The Noctua NF-F12 showed the weakest airflow and noise performance overall, and given its similar price tag to the other fans on this list, perhaps another one of the brand's models should be considered if you're hell-bent on the Noctua or nothing lifestyle. But that's going to do it for this one, guys. Let me know what you thought of the data. I thought it was some really interesting findings, really cool results. Let me know what you think of the new T30 and which of these fans out of the 4 would you put in your build and why? Let me know down below. As always, if you were a fan of this video, make sure to toss a like on it before you go and get subscribed to the channel for more tech content coming at you really soon. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one, and I'll see y'all in the next video.